I'd like to start today by showing you this box. My wife purchased it over 20 years ago at a crafts fair in the hills just outside of Los Angeles. Her father was also selling at the crafts fair that day. The craftsman described to us how he made it. This pattern was done by tracing a template onto the top of the wood and then individually cutting out by hand each one of these little cells. And we didn't have a lot of money at the time, so I can't imagine that this box cost more than maybe $20 or $25. And it amazes me to this day that someone with so much skill could put that much time into something and sell it for such a small sum. My wife has used it for all of those intervening years, and you can see it's taken a little bit of damage at that time. She stored things like jewelry and oils and other things inside of it, and it's meant a lot to her over the years. Now, you could make a box using the exact same materials and techniques that craftsman did today, but I don't think that's how most people would do it. This is a box that I made. It was probably the second thing that I made after I got a laser cutter. I downloaded a set of files which I paid $3 for and gave me 6 different templates. And it probably took maybe 20 minutes for the laser to cut out and 10 minutes for me to assemble it. Now I'd like to show you how to make one of these boxes, but I won't do that at just one level. I consider this a basic level. I will show you how to do that. But then I'm going to step it up one notch and show you a box that takes a little bit more skill and looks a little more professional, I think. And then I'll take it one step beyond that even and have a third box for you to see. I hope whether you have a Glowforge and can create something like this or not, that you'll enjoy seeing how something like this is put together, where we can create a gift that can have some sentimental and lasting value just like this one did, hopefully for years to come. I hope you enjoy it. Let's start with the beginner box now. And for one of the first times, I'm actually able to talk about what I'm working on without having to do a voiceover narration later. And there's a good reason for that. With most of what I'm doing, it's very noisy, and I'm having to wear the right protection gear and pay attention to what I'm doing in order not to lose a finger. In this case, the Glowforge is going to do the work for me. And for each of the 3 boxes, we're going to use a different material. This material here, it's called proof grade material. It comes from Glowforge itself. It's about 1/8 inch thick. In this case, it's maple with an MDF core, and it has a finish on it. So they pre-finish the surface and then they put this tape over it to protect it from burn marks. The one problem is because it's thin, it does become prone to cupping a little bit. So we got a little bit of curve to it. You can fix that though inside the machine while the cut is being done. And I have just printed out a few of these. These are from the exact same material off some scrap I had before. You can push this into the grid that's at the bottom of the Glowforge and hold each of the corners down to keep it straight and flat. Let's get cutting. There's really nothing complicated about this basic box. The material is put in with the QR sticker facing up so the camera can see it, and then I use those little pins and push them into the holes to hold the material down flat. The Glowforge Laser itself is controlled by a web application. You can see that it's already determined what the material is. It shows that in the upper left-hand corner. After that, you simply import the SVG file that you bought with the pattern, and then you lay it out so that it all fits on the material that you had. You press print, and the laser does the rest of the work. Once the cutting is done, you may have to pop out the little pieces that have been cut out. But then you can simply peel off the tape, which removes the burn marks and leaves the pre-finished wood behind. Okay, so the laser has done its job and now it's back to us to assemble. The tape has all come off, so you don't see any burn marks, and I don't think it's a mystery how this is all going to fit together. These sides will come up here, and this top will then sit on top. The only maybe not obvious part is that we're going to have to glue this bit here to the top so that when it sits in, it won't rattle around. It will stay in place. Now, normally when you're working with plywood, it's not a problem to use wood glue. But in this case, we can't do that. Because the finish is on there, as soon as this glue would dry, it would peel right back off again. So instead we have to use this. This is cyanoacrylate glue, normally called CA glue. And you can pick it up all over the place. I get this from my hardwood supplier. It's so commonly used by woodworkers. We'll put this on instead, and we'll use this as an accelerator to get it to dry quicker. And the set only takes a minute or so. And all of this will be ready to be used in its final form. A more familiar name for CA glue is super glue. And even those who haven't done woodworking are probably familiar with that, and know that it sticks to a lot of surfaces, including your fingers. So it's important to use just enough, both on the horizontal and vertical portions of what you're gluing up, and to keep your fingers away. I've also put this little scrap piece against my assembly table to protect my assembly table from being stuck to. The accelerator spray is put on a piece separate from where the glue goes, otherwise you'll harden up the glue before you put the piece on. And it allows the glue to set up in probably 30 to 60 seconds. So I just work my way around, putting all 4 sides onto this box, using the accelerator on the piece that I'm adding to the box. The top plate has very thin connections that will be attaching it to the underplate beneath it. And so what I'm doing is I'm taking the CA glue and putting very tiny drops spread out fairly evenly across the whole plate. I'll then put the accelerator on the base plate and just hold those together for 10 to 15 seconds. And there you are, that's really all there is to it. About 20 minutes or so, like I said, on the laser, and about 5 to 10 minutes to assemble. And it's a very good, nice looking functional box. It does, however, give off a little bit of a sense of a laser cut design. You can tell by the box joints here where the burnt edges go up against the pre-finished edges. It definitely has that look that you might see where people sell just hundreds of these things in little shops. And so, while it may be a perfectly fine and functional box for you in a style that you like, to me it a little bit says there's not a lot of woodworking skill that went into this particular box. And so I'll show you next the style that I do when I normally make these and give these away as gifts. And to do that I need to use a little bit of a different material. In fact, I'm going to use this. And to some extent, it's very much similar material to what you have here. It is a plywood with maple veneers on both sides and an MDF core. This one, however, was 1/8 of an inch thick, while this one is double that at 1/4. It also doesn't have the pre-finish that you get. The material that comes from the laser maker, the proof grade stuff, is actually really quite nice. However, it can be a bit on the pricey side. I actually buy these in 4x8 sheets and cut them down and prepare them to be used in the laser. So that's what we're going to do first. We're going to prepare the material, and then I'll show you how I cut and assemble boxes at a little bit more woodworking skill than this one. Once the material is cut down to 1 foot lengths, I use a water-based polyurethane, and I put 2 coats on each side using a 500 grit sand in between each coat. I prepare material like this quite often, so I bought a very large roll of 12-inch masking tape, which I apply to both sides. The laser itself works best when there's a consistent focal length for the laser, and so I use this card scraper to push the tape against the material evenly across the entire surface. Then it's just a matter of cutting it to length so that it will fit inside of the laser. This style of box requires some more computer skills in addition to the increased woodworking skills, so let me explain. No, there's too much. Let me sum up. The laser works with a file format called Scalable Vector Graphics, and there is a free program available to edit these files called Inkscape. That's what I'm using here. I need to replace the outlines of each of the sides to no longer use those box joints, but instead to be rectangular. And so I select the objects and I move them around and scale them using the numbers at the top rather than just dragging a mouse to make sure that they're precise. Once I have the new shape for the outline, I'm able to select the old one and delete it. Note here too that I'm orienting these sides so that the grain patterns match, unlike the previous box. I'm adding 4 circles here to the same cut that will be done when the top of the box is cut by the laser. These circles will be the feet that go underneath the bottom of the box. I'm also creating an L-shaped pattern here using 2 rectangles. I subtract one from the other, and I will use this L shape as a guide to space my feet from the 4 corners of the bottom of the box. With all of the computer work done, we can put the material into the laser and let it do the work for us. I'm going to be putting 45-degree miters on each side. And there's a few ways to do that, so I cut out a couple extra sides to show you. One way to do it is to use a belt sander like this. I don't recommend this, it's quite difficult to have your miter cut come out straight. There's no reason to get used to disappointment when there are other methods. The next one to try, you can use a miter saw itself with the side oriented vertically. I find there's some deflection in this method as well. You can, however, use the miter saw to tip the blade over and hold the piece firmly down and get a much more accurate cut. Using a chamfer bit on a router table also works. I recommend having a guide behind the piece to keep it squared up as it goes through. And then a final method is to set your table saw blade to a 45-degree angle and send it through. In the end, I found the chamfer bit on the router table to be the easiest method, and so I took all 4 sides and did both ends of those sides and got them all down to an even 45 degrees. To glue up a small box like this, you can take painter's tape and connect all the edges together. I also used this painter's tape on the inside so that if there was any squeeze out on the insides, I could just peel that off and keep it off of the finished surface. Now I should have used a bit longer pieces of tape. You can see them popping off here as I put the box together. But I was able to make it work in the end, and I checked it for square, and everything turned out just fine. I used the laser to cut the base of the box, and when I did so, I engraved a little bit of a shape to give me a guide of where to glue the sides on. I did use CA glue in that particular application, as well as using CA glue for these feet. And you can see I'm using the L-shaped guide to space those out. There's a little more surface area on this particular box than the first one, but I'm still using the same technique to glue that base plate on. And here is the second box. It's a little bit of a larger size, that balances out the thicker material that we use. The construction is mostly the same, but the box joints are gone. I've matched the bottom to the top, so it has that symmetrical look to it, and it has feet on it as well. And you can hear it's big enough that you can fit the first box inside of it. Added a little touch of an engraving of a quote on there. You could do pictures and designs, whatever you wanted to. I think that'll make a great gift for somebody at some point. But to go up one more step, to make it even a little more complicated, there is a limitation to the material that we used here. I like the look of the black here, this kind of carbon that comes from the laser. But the problem is, because this is plywood, we have to kind of go with that pre-finished surface. The veneer on the top of it is very, very thin. You can't sand it. And for this third box that we're going to make, we're going to actually have to use solid wood because we're going to need to sand it. And the laser will cut solid wood. It will not cut solid wood this thick, but if we get it down to 1/4 of an inch, it will. And you'll see why we need to do that as we go. I have 3/4 inch material here, and I should be able to get 2 1/4 inch pieces out of that. And to do that, I just need to take it through the bandsaw and resaw it. That will leave a jagged edge on one side, which you can fix on a thickness planer or a jointer, preferably a planer. I still want to protect against burn marks, so I'm having to put the tape on both sides. Note here though that I have not pre-finished this wood ahead of time. The finish is going to have to come later. The sides themselves this time are actually going to be 1/2 inch thick. That means they're going to have a portion that's cut by the laser and a portion which is a solid backing. And I'm cutting out the backing here by ripping them through the table saw. Now I need a much tighter seal this time, than I have in the previous cases where I've glued things together. And so I'm not using either CA glue or wood glue. In this case, I'm going to use some epoxy that I've mixed up to act as a glue. In order to get that pressure evenly across the entire surface, it took a lot of these little clamps. And I used a little bit more of the epoxy brushed in just to make sure I was sealing up all of those edges. I then had to give it a good 24 hours to set up. The reason I took the time to get these sealed up properly is that I'm actually going to try and go for a stained glass look on this piece. So I've mixed up some more epoxy and added a red dye to it so that we can color in these roses here. You have to be very careful in applying this epoxy. You can't let it spill over into the other cells of a different color. So I'm using this little stick here to kind of drip the epoxy into the appropriate cells. And it's important that it rises above the level of the surface of the wood and forms a little bit of a meniscus that you can sand down later. I was nervous enough after doing the red and green that I let those set up a bit before I came back and did this sky blue color in between the leaves. I let that all set up overnight, then I went to sand it down, and here I'm actually sanding off the edges so that I get rid of that burnt look from the laser. I'm then also sanding off the epoxy on the top. It's important to wear a mask here to keep that epoxy dust out. Also, they're terribly comfortable. I think everybody will be wearing them in the future. I switched up techniques for cutting the miter with it being 1/2 of an inch, and I went to my miter saw, put a stop block in there, and made sure that when I did all of these cuts, they would come out the exact same size. I want the top of the box to actually look like it's still 3/4 of an inch, but the laser won't cut that size out. So I'm actually taking the shaper and I'm boring a hole into the top that's 1/2 an inch down so that there's a 1/4 inch on top to cut through. I then flipped the lid over and drew out exactly where the box is going to go and where the pattern needs to be. Because now I need to align that hole that I cut underneath with the pattern that's going to be cut into it. And that's actually a fairly difficult thing to do because the camera on the Glowforge is not very precise at all. In order to get the placement just right, I actually put some rectangles on that were outside the pattern and had the laser score those in place, then made micro adjustments to the piece until those scores ended up in the exact right position. After that, it's up to the laser to cut the pattern out. Alright, quick timeout. I just finished laser cutting the top of the box, the lid, and that was a lot more frightening than I thought it was going to be. This is the first time that I've ever cut something where there was a hollow beneath it. Usually the board is sitting right up against the metal plate underneath it, and I cut that bottom out before. And I hadn't realized the implications of that. What ended up happening as I was lasering out the little pieces is that they would drop down and then they'd kind of scatter around on the bottom a little bit. And the laser would come through on the next piece nearby and it would go through and hit the piece that had already fallen. And they would start flaming up a little bit. In fact, they flamed up enough that I had to stop the job twice and put out a little fire. I fortunately kept this little dropper full of water here, and I came through and I took the fire out. Anyway, here's the result. Right there, you can see that most of them had fallen through, and this is what I'm talking about. Just a whole bunch of little pieces here that were just getting hit constantly by the laser. But all's well that ends well. It looks like a great pattern, and I'll start prepping it so that we can fill it with the epoxy. Using the markings on the tape, I was able to cut all 4 sides out on the miter saw and get the lid to its final dimensions. I need a backing under the lid as well, and if I'm going to be able to put some colored epoxy in there. And this is the one instance where I was able to use the MDF core plywood, because you won't be able to see the sides of this piece once it's glued in. And I'm gluing it in here again using the same epoxy technique that I used before, trying to get all of those cells sealed up as best I can. There were a couple little spots on the sides where there was a bubble, or maybe I didn't get that meniscus up high enough. And so I took a little bit of the remaining clear epoxy and filled those in on the sides and let them set up. I was leaving the next day for a little rafting adventure with my son. I knew I'd be away, so I was trying to get all of the colored epoxy in that night so that it would be nice and set up in the morning. This meant putting each of the 3 colors in without letting the previous colors set up first, which is definitely a little precarious. Well, it's the next morning, and you could say that things didn't turn out great. In fact, I believe I committed one of the classic blunders when it comes to working with epoxy. The first of which is never get involved in a land war in Asia. Now that doesn't seem right. Anyway, the blunder that I committed was that I wasn't patient. I didn't give the epoxy enough time to set up. And so what you have here with the colors, if you look closely, is a lot of bleed over. The reds have gone into the greens have gone into the blues, and in fact, in this case, all 3 colors are mixed together, and it doesn't look good. In addition to that, because it leaked through, it basically glued itself to this protective board I put between the piece and the assembly table. All in all, it's kind of a wreck. But I do know that the technique is correct. Each one of the side pieces looks great. Now it's not as bright and shiny as this down here, but that's because I've sanded it at a rough grit. I'm going to take it up to 500 and then get some finish on it, and it'll look just like this, nice and bright. So I do know that the technique is correct, but like usual, as a first time for something for me, I've kind of messed it up. So I guess, let's do it again. I know that some of you may find it inconceivable that I make so many mistakes, but I do like to show them here. I also wanted to show that while I normally use a disc sander, in this case I pulled out my jitterbug in order to smooth things down in the corners. Once I have the new piece, I take it over to the laser to cut once again and to align it. And you can see there that I put an insert in the back this time so that the pieces wouldn't fall through. What you can see as I lifted it up, the pieces were all there until I lifted it up and then they fell out. I also decided to up my game from the previous box by bringing in my box strap clamps and checking once again to make sure that everything was nice and square. Then you can see that the backing piece was cut just a little bit short compared to the outsides so that I would have a recess in which to put this bottom piece, leaving it so you can't see it from the outside. The epoxy work still needed to be done with the same amount of care, but this time I allowed the colors to set up before I poured them in. So the first 2 I was very careful with, but by the time I got to the green, all the other cells had been filled in and I was able to mostly just pour it out of the cup directly into all of the cells. While I didn't record it, I did have to make a 4th pass with some clear epoxy to fill the bubble holes. But I was, for the most part, pretty good about keeping the epoxy stuck up high enough that I was able to sand it all back down. To add just a little bit more of a design element, I put a 1/2-inch chamfer onto the sides of the box top. Using a chisel, I then took out a couple of notches in the back of the box so that I could recess some hinges in for the lid. I'm using a hard wax finish here, and like I said, I had sanded these down to 500 grit, and it's just really nice seeing the colors start to pop out as you get that finish applied to them. I put 2 coats of finish on each, and I was sure to wipe off any excess to make sure it all came out smooth. The final step is to put the hinges in place. I used a center punch to mark with the hole locations. I pre-drilled out the area for the screw, and then I just hand screwed them in. And here they are. 3 decorative laser cut boxes, each one with a slightly different pattern, and more importantly, each one with an increased amount of woodworking skill that's necessary to put them together. As an added bonus, I even took this box that my wife bought all those years ago, and I did what I could to repair that broken corner. Not a perfect repair, but I did what I could with the materials that were there. Now I know you haven't seen this box in as much detail as the others, and I thought it might be helpful to compare my first attempt with the final product here. You can see these bleeding colors that aren't present in the final box, and obviously it's still stuck to the panel beneath it. And that just goes to show you that taking the right amount of time, being a little patient, and putting care into the process while you're building really does make a difference in the end. There is one other thing about these boxes. Not only did they take an increased amount of woodworking skill to put them together, but they took an increased amount of time too. As I mentioned, this box took me about 5 to 10 minutes to assemble. This one, cutting the miters, getting them put together, letting the glue set up, probably 2 or 3 hours. But this last one here, this one was days worth of effort. Not only with the replacement of the top and redoing that, but each one of these sides, getting all of the colors in, letting them set up, getting the sanding in between, getting it ready for finish, putting the hinges in, adding the little style details, all of that went into making this a much more involved build. And that really just goes to show that the amount of time and effort and skill that goes into something like this is probably something you couldn't recoup if you were to sell it. Much like the box that my wife bought from that woodworker in that craft fair so long ago. And yet, even knowing that, I can see myself in the future, when I'm retired, putting a bunch of these together, going to a craft fair, and talking to people about what it took to put this together, and maybe hoping that they might take one home and it might mean something to them for years to come, even if all I got back out of it maybe was a replacement of the material costs. I'd love to hear what you think of each one of these boxes. Maybe there's an idea that I missed in putting these together. I'd love to know about that too. Might be something I try in the future. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I know not everyone has a laser cutter, but I hope it was still something interesting for you to watch. And I do hope to see you in the next one when we can build something together again.